it is not the board that the competitive categories. Okay, that's yeah.
All right. Good afternoon to you all. Welcome to today's lecture.
Good afternoon.
Okay. The number is not encouraging, but we'll start. I mean, I'm sure people know that students with me here. But because I'm with them, they are not going to log on. They will just listen to me directly. But we'll start because we don't have too much time on our hands. And I'm sure some people are waiting for the recording for them to go through. Some are busy and all that. So we'll start. So this week, our model is looking at introduction to costing and healthcare service costing. So basically, we introduce you to costing, and then we'll zoom in on healthcare service costing, which is very relevant to us as healthcare managers. We'll start by looking at key definition. Cost. Cost is a measurement of the amount of resources sacrificed. So if you remember, one of the things we do in accounting mostly is to do what we call measurement. So if you are able to sacrifice a certain resource, be it material resource, labor, or any form of resource, and you're able to quantify it, then that becomes a cost. What is a cost object or cost unit? It is an activity for which a separate measure of cost is desired. It's a cost unit. So you can talk about reagent cost as a unit. You can talk about medicine cost as a unit. You can even talk about salary as a cost unit. All these are referred to as cost unit or cost objects. And in that case, the reason we are referring to it as cost unit is that you should be able to estimate the cost of just one unit, so that if you are dealing with many more, then you can multiply by the number that you are looking at. So if it is the cost of a certain lab test, 50 cedis. So the cost unit is, say, 50 cedis per test. That is a cost unit. Or consultation fee is 100 cedis per consultation. That is a cost unit. All right. Cost analysis is an activity that uses engineering, time and motion studies, timekeepers records, and planning schedules from production supervisors. This is more of production cost. We'll look at it in the course of our lecture today. So it's basically looking at analyzing the cost that arises, and by using engineering techniques, time and motion studies, and then the keeping of records and all those things to do your analysis. What is a cost center? A cost center is basically any point or any place within the facility where costs are gathered. So the head of that facility or that unit will be interested in gathering costs across the healthcare facility in order to control them, in order to fix responsibility, who is responsible for these costs, in order to determine who is responsible for them, and to be able to enable costs to be charged on an equitable basis, so that the cost center within your facility will be interested in gathering all the costs within the facility. Now, there are some costs that you can directly attribute to a particular department or unit or product or service. There are some that are shared costs. You gather all of them, and then based on the shared cost, you'll be able to share the cost among the various units or among the various services that benefit from these costs. So the cost center is responsible for that. There are other centers like revenue center, investment center. We are not interested in them because here we are dealing with just cost. Still on definition of key terms, we are looking at direct costs. What are direct costs? So I mentioned earlier that there are some costs that you can directly attribute to a certain activity. So for instance, if you are looking at the cost of a particular diagnostic test, and within that cost, you can talk about costs such as reagent cost. So if you're looking at a diagnostic cost or a laboratory service cost, which costs you about 100 cedis. Now, within that cost, there is a component, which is the cost of reagents. Now, you can directly attribute the cost of the reagent or associate the cost of the reagent to that test. There are certain costs that you cannot directly attribute to them. Those ones are indirect costs. So if you're talking about direct costs, we are looking at the cost that you can easily and specifically identify and attribute it to that cost. Now, if you put all your direct costs together, there are several direct costs, because you can have direct cost of material, direct cost of labor, direct cost of whatever. Once you put all of them together, you arrive at what we call prime cost. So prime cost is the summation of all direct costs incurred in a production. It comprises direct material, direct labor cost, and direct expenses. We'll be looking at these in detail later. Variable costs, these are costs that changes in direct proportion to changes in the level of activity. Now we say something is variable. It means that it is directly proportional to the activity you are undertaking. So if you are taking care of patients, let's say if your facility takes care of 100 patients in a week, the cost associated with taking care of these 100 patients, if the cost increases anytime an additional patient is taken care of, then that becomes a variable cost. It means that it varies according to the number of activities. So that if you're taking care of one, if you're taking care of one patient, there's a certain cost. If you're taking care of 2 patients, it doubles. If you're taking care of 3 patients, it triples, that kind of thing. That is what we call variable cost. So it's directly proportional. Now, there are some costs that when the level of activity changes, those costs will not change. For instance, you have rented a facility for your hospital. In a month, you take care of 200 patients. If the number of patients increase from 200 to 300, the cost of your rent does not change. It is the same rent. The landlord will not come and tell you that, oh, I realize that this month you are taking care of 300 patients, so pay more rent. No. So the rent cost becomes what we call a fixed cost. But if you have to deal with things like medicines, things like reagents, anytime you increase the number of patients you are taking care of, those costs increase. So that become what? Variable costs. So variable cost is directly opposite to what? Fixed cost. So fixed cost is a cost that does not change with the level of output. It is also referred to as autonomous cost. Indirect cost. These are costs that will not be directly attributable to a specific product. I mentioned this earlier. Marginal cost represents the additional cost of producing an extra unit of an output. So marginal cost of producing, let's say, a bottle of water is the cost or the additional cost you will incur if you want to produce another unit of the bottle of water. Now let's look at manufacturing costs. Manufacturing costs are costs incurred to produce a product. So if you are dealing with a product, you are dealing with, say, producing bottles of water, then you are talking about what? Manufacturing costs. What are the elements of manufacturing costs? They include direct material costs. So any material that goes into producing your bottle of water, such as the water itself, such as the bottle itself, these are direct material costs, the cost associated with the water itself and the bottle. Because at the end of the day, the water and the bottle will form part of the final product you are going to sell. So that becomes what? Direct material cost. Direct labor costs, these are costs that are directly attributable to the labor. So for instance, the factory floor workers, the cost of paying them their salaries is a direct labor cost. There is also what we call overhead costs. Overhead costs are simply indirect costs. There are some costs that are not directly associated with the product you are producing. So if in the course of your production, you used things like oil to oil the machine that produces the water, the oil does not form part of the final product. It only helps the machine to work properly. So that is an overhead cost. Or the overhead costs can also refer to things like the costs of paying your supervisors. Supervisors are not directly involved on the factory floor. It is the direct factory floor workers who are involved in working. Supervisors may be supervising different factory floors. Let's say you have 3 factory floors and it is one supervisor who is overseeing their work. So his work is not directly associated with their product. So that becomes an overhead cost. And then also you can have an administration where after the goods are produced, the administration will take care of things like distributing the products to to customers. The cost of paying their salaries become what? Overhead costs. Material costs. Materials refer to all the physical inputs into the production process. So all the physical inputs, as we talked about, the water in the case of the bottled water, the plastic itself, these are what? Materials. Material cost also includes finished goods. So when you are successfully able to finish producing the water, the cost of the material becomes what? material cost. And sometimes in the cost of production, there are some things that you would not complete producing. We put them under what we call work in progress. You haven't completed them. Maybe you have poured the water into the bottle. You are yet to cap it. You haven't capped them. And then the production has stopped. That becomes what? Work in progress, because it's not completed. The costs of these are also referred to as material costs. Now, even with material costs, we can classify them as either direct material cost or indirect material cost. Direct material cost can be easily traced to a product without any extra cost. So anything that is direct, if you hear direct, it means that you can easily trace it. So I gave example earlier. The cost of the bottle is a direct material. The cost of the water itself is a direct material. Indirect material are costs that cannot become an integral part of the finished product, but may be traceable into the product only at great cost or inconvenience. Like I mentioned, the cost of oiling the machines that will produce the water. These are what? Indirect material cost. Now let's look at labor cost. Labor cost simply is looking at the cost of employing labor, the cost of employing labor. And that too can be direct or indirect. So direct labor costs are wages paid to workers who are directly involved in the production of each item produced. And you can physically trace to the creation of the product, because it's what? It's direct. Indirect labor costs refer to wages paid to workers whose effort cannot be directly or readily identified with specific product units. So like we mentioned, if you are dealing with a manufacturing organization, maybe you are manufacturing medicines, you have a department that is into accounting or human resource. If you are paying them, they are what? Indirect labor cost. But a guy who is working inside the factory, what you pay him is referred to as what? Direct labor costs. So these are terms that we have to clearly understand and be able to distinguish. Overhead costs. They are called overhead costs. Whenever you hear overhead costs, it means indirect costs. Indirect costs. So they are also called indirect production costs. They include all costs of manufacturing except direct materials and direct labor. They are incurred for the benefit of all products. Thus, the amount of overhead allocated can only be an estimate. So sometimes overhead costs, you can look at overhead costs as costs that are shared. They are not direct. So for instance, if you are incurring costs on providing internet services to the organization or to the factory, it is not easy to say 1 unit of the product, let's say the bottle of water, you use a certain megabyte or data volume to produce the water. It is something difficult to do. So unless you go through certain processes to be able to now share the cost among all the products that you have produced. So that is what? An overhead cost. So overhead costs are usually general costs that must be shared among everybody. They include indirect material, indirect labor, and other indirect expenses that cannot be traced directly to a product. They are at times referred to as factory burden, factory overheads, or manufacturing expense. So the ones we have looked at so far are mainly manufacturing costs. Now let's turn our attention to non-manufacturing costs. Non-manufacturing costs such as administration costs. So the cost you incur at your administration department is referred to as a non-manufacturing cost. The cost you incur in selling your products is a non-manufacturing cost. Distribution costs, these are costs associated with warehousing the products and their delivery to customers. These are also what? Non-manufacturing costs. Finance costs, you probably may have incurred costs of borrowing funds. So the interest you pay on it, and then the overdrafts you take from your bank are all what? Finance costs, and these are non-manufacturing costs. Research and development costs are also non-manufacturing costs because you would have done your research and development before you even start your production. So these are all non-manufacturing costs. So you should be able to distinguish these costs because they are very relevant to costing. Now, we are going to zoom on to healthcare service costing. Now, healthcare service costing can basically be looked at in terms of micro costing approach, which is also referred to as a bottom-up approach, or what we call standard costing. Now, micro costing or the bottom-up approach, this approach requires the researcher or even the manager to identify and specify all of the resources that are used by individual patients. So if you have patients coming to your facility, you look at all the resources, the medicines, the nurses, the cost of paying nurses, laboratory staff, doctors, water, electricity. You identify all these costs. And then you gather them. So usually you can gather them based on things like if you have an information system that can easily gather these costs, you gather them. All of the actual cost of individual treatment and services are assigned to that one case. So for instance, if you are taking, you want to look at the cost of providing a service to a particular patient. So now you are going to look at what went into providing the service to the patient. What went into providing the service to the patient? The medicines, the lab tests, the nursing care services, and all of that. You identify all of them. For example, calculating the micro cost for an intensive care unit requires identifying the values for drugs and supplies used in treating the patient, identification and calculation of the nursing costs involved, cost of physician services provided, cost of equipment, and any other cost that can be contributed to the individual ICU stay. So you have to identify all these individual costs. And this approach, the cost of similar cases may vary because of a small difference in the treatment and or services. So because we are picking individual costs, it means that depending on the kind of service you are providing to the patient, depending on the kind of treatment you are providing to the patient, the costs will be different. Now, the other type of costing is what we refer to as standard costing, commonly referred to as average costing. Now, with this method, what you do is that you take the total healthcare expenditure. So for the year, you look at all the cost of your medicines, all the cost of your lab reagents, all the cost of your consumables, your salaries, allowances, equipment, everything. You put all of them together, and then you look at how many patients you served during the year. So if you put all the costs together and say you arrive at, say, 1 million, you look at the costs. Let me use the example here. For example, if a hospital spends $2 million treating all patients and 2,000 patients were treated during the year, the average cost per case is $1,000. So that becomes your cost. So indirectly, you can say that every patient that comes to the hospital for any case or for any issue, whether surgery or medical attention or whatever it is, should be paying what? $1,000. Or this is the cost that would have been spent on each patient. So this is what? Another form of what? Service costing within our healthcare facilities. Now, specifically under standard costing, we can also look at what we call per diem costing and case mix costing. Per diem costing and case mix costing. Now, per diem is not the per diem we receive for our meetings and other things. We'll look at what it really means. Now, what is per diem costing? Per diem costing can be calculated by dividing the total expenditure for services by the total number of days of service to give an average cost per day. So you can look at the expenditure. Say a patient comes into your facility and spends, say, 10 days on admission. So you're going to consider all the cost of providing the services to the patient and divide by the number of days the patient was on admission. Then you arrive at what we call per diem cost. Now, there's a disadvantage with this kind of costing because with this, it is unable to tell you for different cases how much cost it actually, how much is actually costing the health facility. It is not able to tell you. But if you're looking at a population-wide, if you are using this for a whole lot of patients within the hospital, then that makes sense. Population-based perspective may appropriately use per diem cost, particularly when differences in user characteristics are not important or more suitable data are not available. So sometimes if you don't have detailed information or data, you can go straight and use the per diem cost. This approach has been used for costing hospital, personal care, home care, and other services. So these are usually broad. You want to know, okay, on average, how much does it cost us to treat our patients? Then you can use what we call the per diem cost to arrive at that figure. But if you want to look at how much it costs us to treat, say, complicated malaria or severe malaria, then you need more information. And that in that case, you cannot use per diem costing to do it. Then in that case, you use what we call case mix costing. Now here, patients are divided into clinically meaningful groups that are expected to use similar amount of hospital resources. The case mix system assigns a relative weight to patient cases and assumes a standard consumption of resources among similar cases. So all patients with who are coming for surgery or even a particular kind of surgery, you group them. All patients who are coming for treatment for severe malaria, you group them. Patients who are coming for renal, treatment, you group them. So here you classify your patients because you have information. Now, the end game is that with case mix costing, you're able to tell how much it costs to treat, say, diabetes, how much it costs to treat severe malaria, how much it costs to treat chronic kidney diseases. So that is more case specific or disease specific, unlike the per diem costing. Now, usually the per diem costing is used for maybe general reporting. So a hospital like, let's say Korle Bu can say, oh, Korle Bu Hospital spends about 2,000 Ghana cedis to treat each patient, but it will not be able to tell you that we spend this particular amount on treating severe malaria or treating cases like diabetes. That won't be. So usually per diem costing will give you a broad idea. It gives you a fair idea how much it costs to treat patient, but case mix will tell you specific cases, how much it costs to treat specific cases. Now, if you're doing costing for healthcare, you could be looking at costing the whole hospital, which is referred to as hospital service costing, or you want to look at the cost related to your physician or your home care services, personal care home services, diagnostic services, pharmaceutical services. And all these would have different or specific approaches. We may not have time to deal with each of them into detail, but we'll talk about them as we go along. Now let's look at hospital or costing hospital services. Hospital services include both inpatient and outpatient procedure. Sometimes a patient can come in and within the same day, you can provide a certain surgery or surgical intervention, and then they go. They are your outpatient. Your inpatient could be there on admission for several days. Now, you can prepare or you can have a way of providing costing for such services. You can also look at things such as we mentioned earlier, cost of standard hospital care. Like we mentioned, a hospital can tell you that for us, we spend, let's say, 1,000 cedis on treating each patient. So all these are embodied in under what? Costing hospital services. Now, physician costing systems. Some physicians are paid fee for service. If you go to some facilities, it may not be very typical of our health service, where usually staff are paid based on salary. If you go to some jurisdiction, some physicians or some healthcare workers are paid based on fee for service. So the service that they provide, they charge a certain fee for it. Others use the salary system, where at the end of the month, they are paid. It doesn't matter how many cases they have worked on, how many tests they have run, how many patients they have seen. You pay them a fixed amount of salary at the end of the month. Session rate, you can use session rate. So in terms of the number of sessions they do within a day, and then you calculate it over the month, and then you pay them. So this one will always vary, session rate. Fee for service will also always vary. Salary would invariably stay the same if you are using it. And then there's also another type we refer to as what? Contract costing, where a particular professional is on contract. You pay them based on the contract, the terms of the contract. Now, once these services are provided, then you expect that the professional will submit a claim. For instance, especially typically for the fee-based payment, and then the session rate, and then the contract rate. You submit a claim for the salary or for the remuneration to be paid. Now let's look at the home care service or costing home care services. In costing home care services, where the patient is sitting in their homes and then you go and provide services to them, you would usually want to use what we refer to as the per diem costing method. Now here you have to derive data from your hospital, and then you use that to cost for the service you are going to provide for them in their homes. So what we do usually is for you to get a total expenditure and then divide by the number of patients, and then you use that to cost for the home care services. Let's look at costing laboratory services. Costing laboratory services will usually be based on things like the cost or the price of the reagents, which is a major input to your services provision. The frequency of testing, how many times that test is taken by a patient is very important. Equipment amortization. So you have an equipment. The equipment is supposed to be used for, say, 5 years or 10 years. You have to amortize it and be able to share the cost on each test or each test count that you provide. Things like maintenance charges would also come in. Quality assurance costs, such as QC materials. If the facility is engaged in external QA programs, the cost would also be part of the costing for the laboratory tests. Personnel costs, that is wages and salaries, and other facility costs such as electricity, water, internet services, and all that. All these will form part of costing laboratory services. Costing pharmaceutical services. Here, we are more interested in also the cost of the drugs. Usually, the facility would buy the drugs, and then some of the drugs would go through some internal processes, maybe mixing them or reconstituting them. So you have to look at the cost of all that. Or sometimes you have to add certain ingredients to it. You look at all those costs. And then the professional or dispensing fee would also be included. And then other facility costs such as electricity, water, internet services, and etc. Now, after you have determined all these costs, how do you charge your patient, or how do you set the price for your fee. Because basically, once you know your cost, you would be able to, or you should be able to set the fee in such a way that it will cover your cost so that you don't run at a loss. So how do you do that? There are two main ways of doing that. You can either set your service fee based on the cost, or you set it based on the value that you are providing. Now, if it is based on cost, you look at all the costs that you have incurred, and then you add a certain margin. Let's say 10%, 20%, 30%, 50%, or whatever it is. This is one way. The other way, as I mentioned, is to use value-based. Now, with value-based, your focus is on the kind of value you are providing. So it may not matter so much the cost you are incurring, but the value you provide for the service or the value you provide for the patient. So it may cost you so little, let's say 50 cedis to provide that service. But because of the value on it, you can charge as much as 5,000 Ghana cedis. That is a value-based costing. Or a value-based costing can also look at, okay, how much are our competitors charging? Our competitors are charging for this particular service 500 cedis. Okay, let's also charge a little above 500 cedis or a little below 500 cedis to attract more people. So this is what value-based service costing. Now, value-based pricing depends on the strength of the benefit you can prove you offer to your customers. If your customers place high value on it, then it means you can charge high cost. Imagine a facility let's take it, Mamprobi Hospital, providing a service like, let's say, treating diabetes. Compare it to a place like Nyaho Medical Center. Nyaho Medical Center can place a premium on their service and say, okay, if we are treating diabetes, we are going to charge 5,000 cedis, because they feel that patients will place more value on the kind of services they provide. Whereas a place like Mamprobi Polyclinic or Mamprobi Hospital will charge you maybe around 500 Ghana cedis, because they know that if they charge you more than 500 Ghana cedis, you may not be able to afford, or you will not attend their hospital. So this is what purely value-based fee charging. Now, why are we interested in costing all these things? Now, we do costing basically because, one, we want to know the cost of our stock. So sometimes you may have certain items in your stores, like your medicines, your consumables, your reagents, you keep them in store. Now, if you are able to carry out a costing or a particular costing, then you will be able to determine what the cost of those materials are in your store. So that based on that, you can determine your service cost. Or, God forbid, if something happens and you lose some of the items, either through theft or let me say it got burnt, you'll be able to determine that, oh, this is the value of the items in store that got burnt, or this is the value of the items in store that got stolen. So that is one main purpose for preparing costing. You also want to prepare costing in order to make decision. In order to make what? Decision. So it's for decision making or for control purposes. If you know the cost of your items or of your services, you are able to control the cost. So if you know that there's so much cost involved in providing laboratory services or selling medicines to patients, then of course you can control if there are loopholes, if there are ways you can improve the costing, then you'll be able to what? Control your costing. So these are some of the reasons why we cost for our product and services. Today's lecture is quite short, and so this is the end of our lecture today. So open the floor for questions.
Okay. Sure.
Hello.
Yes, Latif.
Yes.
Thank you for the presentation.
Okay.
I want us to have a practical way of costing. Let's take, for instance, in the laboratory setting.
Okay.
You want to do, say, liver function tests.
Okay.
And then you want to cost it.
Okay.
How do you go about it? Because
right.
apart from, let's say, the reagents that you buy,
Mm.
how do you cost the other things, electricity, water, and what have you, in addition?
Okay. So let me go back to, like I said, going to do these things into detail would involve a lot. So I will still be able to explain to you how you'll be able to do your costing for laboratory service. Yeah, costing for laboratory service. So if you're costing for a test, like say you said LFT, first of all, you have to identify all the costs, or let me say all the items that go into providing that service. So your reagents, your reagent cost. So typically what you can do is that, okay, in the year, how much reagents did you procure for LFTs? How much reagents did you procure for the whole year? You look at in the year, how much consumables did you use? So gloves, cotton wool, things like specimen bottle, excuse me. You identify all of them and look at the cost for all of these. You look at your rent for the year. You look at electricity cost for the year. You look at your staff cost for the year. So you identify all these costs and know how much it is for the year. Now, when you are done, you divide it by the number of tests that you run. So it will be able to tell you the cost per unit. Is that clear?
Okay, all right.
Okay.
And so for, let's say, in a hospital,
okay,
where maybe the lab doesn't have a separate meter for water and electricity.
Okay.
How can that be determined?
Okay. So you do that based on what we call overhead sharing. We saw overhead earlier. We said that overheads are indirect costs that are, you cannot directly attribute it. So in terms of electricity, it is not so easy to say that the lab consumed this amount of what, electricity, or the lab consumed this amount of what, water, because there's no meter for the lab alone. The meter is for the whole hospital. So what you do is that you look at a fair basis of sharing this cost. So electricity, with electricity, you can look at, okay, how many equipment are the lab using, or how many gadgets is the lab using? So you identify all the equipment in the lab, the power consumption for the year, the bulbs that they are using, all the items in the lab. You'll be able to quantify the electricity consumption, because for every item, there is a wattage, or there is a, what do you call it? Let me say wattage. It tells you the consumption of that item per hour. So you can use that to determine how many or how much electricity it has consumed for the year. Now you do this for all the items or all the gadgets in the hospital. Now, when you finish, you look at the total cost of electricity, and then now you share it among the items in the whole hospital. So then you'll be able to tell how much is going to be allocated to the lab, how much is going to be allocated to the consulting room, how much is going to be allocated to the administration unit. Is that okay? Now, if you have now been able to determine how much is shared or allocated to the lab, now within the lab space, you are providing services such as maybe LFT, malaria, what do you call it? All the tests that you have. Now, you are going to share the cost of this electricity among all these tests that you are providing within the lab. So for every test, there's a portion of the electricity that would go to the test. For every test, there's a portion of water that will be allocated to the test. So by the time you finish, you would have shared all these overhead costs to each and individual test that you are running within the facility. And of course, this will be based on the number of times you do or you run this test within the year.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Then the third question is
Okay.
I've just lost. I've just lost.
Okay, so you can, when you remember, you can ask it.
Yeah.
Okay. There is someone is here. He's raising his hand, so I'll give him the floor to ask a question.
Yeah, thank you, Senior Epes. The first submission that you made concerning using LFT as an example,
Okay.
you made the price for each item. So are you going to do for only, assuming the example that you gave, meaning that you are only running LFT?
Mm-hmm.
So are we going to do the same for other tests that you run? For I was thinking you put all together before you divide by the number of tests that.
Okay, so let me explain that further. So I said that's why we went through classification of costs. There are direct costs and indirect costs. So for each test, let's say you have a column for LFT. LFT, you identify the direct cost. What are the direct costs? The costs that are directly associated with LFT, such as the cost of reagents. The cost of LFT reagents is different from the cost of, say, BUE test. So for each of the tests, you identify the direct ones first. So under each test, you have the cost of reagents. Under each test, you have a cost of reagents. Now, when you are done, you come and look at the overhead costs, the cost that all of them share together, such as electricity. So you look at the total electricity and you share it among all the tests, LFT, BUE, lipids, malaria, sickling, and all those things. So you share it among all of them. Then now when you finish, for each of them, you now come and put them together. And then you'll be able to tell how much it is for LFT, how much it is for BUE, how much it is for malaria, and all that. Is that clear?
Yeah, that's okay. It's going to be a serious work anyway.
It's actually a lot of, you need a lot of data, you need a lot of patience to go through. And if you're using Excel, it helps a lot. Yes, it helps a lot. All right, you're welcome. Any more questions?
Hello, Mr.
Yes. Okay.
Hello.
Mr. Lassie, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Esther.
Yes. So in one of your submissions, one of your examples, I've forgotten which costs it was under. You were saying that, for instance, if you treat for 200 patients and you increase the number of patients to 400, your rent will not change. And so the rent is, which type of cost did you say it was?
That is a fixed cost.
A fixed cost. But I was just thinking out loud, what if now you have to go for extra space?
Okay.
Does the rent still hold as a fixed cost? Let's say your 200, you could take care, one room could take care of 200 people. Now you have 400, so you need extra space. So your rent will have to go higher. In that case, is rent still a fixed cost or is not fixed?
All right. So this is what we refer to as cost behavior. Every cost has a way they behave. Now, you can have a cost that behaves in such a way that anytime you increase your level of activity, it increases. So that is what we call a variable cost. There are costs that are fixed no matter the number of activities you undertake, they are fixed. And there are certain costs that beyond a certain limit, I mean, within a certain limit, let's say 200 patients, it will remain fixed. Beyond 200, then it will increase. So that is the question you are asking. Beyond 200, then that cost becomes what we refer to as stepped fixed cost. So it's like a staircase. It's flat for
some length. And then when it gets to some length, then it moves up.
Okay.
And once it moves up, it now stays the same for another period. And then beyond that, it moves up again. So that becomes like a step, the staircase, the way the staircase looks like. So in this example, this example is referred to as stepped fixed cost. So now the cost will change its behavior from being a fixed cost to what we call stepped fixed cost.
Okay. All right. Okay. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Okay. Hello. I can now remember my question. Can I?
Okay.
Yeah. I was saying that in the cost buildup, in adding the margin, what is the reasonable percentage that you should add?
Okay. There's actually no reasonable percentage. It depends on how you arrive at your cost. Now, even with the cost that you have looked at, that is the cost plus, it depends on whether you have actually looked at all the costs of your service, or you just looked at the ones that are direct. Because probably it may be difficult for you to share the indirect cost. Sharing indirect cost is a whole lot of work on its own. So you may decide that you are looking at just the direct cost. Now, the direct cost is easier because you can directly tell. Cost of reagent, you can directly tell. But when it comes to things like cost of electricity, it's difficult. So you want to just stop at what? The direct cost. Now, if you are looking at direct cost, then your percentage should be high enough to be able to cover your overhead costs. Is that okay? If you are looking at total cost, which includes both the direct and the indirect, then the percentage markup, you are adding should be something reasonable to give you some little profit, or reasonable profit. I won't say little profit, reasonable profit. So there's actually no hard and fast rule about what percentage you should use as your markup or your cost plus. It will depend on your experience and your expectation from your patients.
Okay. And so, for instance, if you are in business, and then at the end of the day, you make 20% profit, will you say you are in good business?
So it will depend on your expectation. So shareholders, as we mentioned earlier, they have some expectation of what the business should bring them. If they expect that you give them minimum of 20%, then 20% would be okay. If they expect you to give them 30% because they have put in so much, then your profit margin should be 30%. So it depends on what the shareholder or the owner of the business expects. That too, there's no hard and fast rule about it. But at the end of the day, it should be able to appeal. It should be appealing to the owners of the organization.
Okay. All right. Thanks. Thank you.
Any more questions? No more question. Okay. If there's no more question, I think we can bring today's lecture to an end.
Latif, I want to say today has been one of the nicest lectures so far.
And short too.
And short. Get to the point. We hope the quiz will be the same.
Yes, the quiz wouldn't be that difficult as usual.
Yeah. Really. All right.
Hello, Mr. Latif.
Yes.
Please, I have a concern.
Okay.
The assignment that we don't want that you gave us now, the model 5.
Okay.
You've also stated that 2 pages. This is calculation. Calculation, you can't say you should limit ourselves to 2 pages or something. And we have to show working. You are not providing just answers. So I think if you can take that clause out, it will be helpful.
Okay. All right. If that is a concern coming, I think we'll take it. We'll take it. So if you can go beyond 2 pages, but just try as much as possible not to write too much.
Sure, sure.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you too.
Any more concerns? No.